All right, so welcome everyone to our last session of In a Nutshell, our monthly webinar series where we hear from MCC local and international experts, as well as other local educators to discuss rotating topics around social issues, peace, and justice. These webinars were incited in the hopes of building relationships, facilitating a space for learning, and hopefully inspiring conversation beyond into all your respective contexts. So thank you for being here. We're so happy to have you, and I implore you from wherever you're tuning in from to engage with us together as we discuss refugee resettlement, migration, and the impacts of the pandemic on the refugee crisis. My name is Gemma Bridgefoot, and I will be facilitating our time together. And before we get started, I wanted to encourage you all to subscribe to our committee newsletter. If you want to stay up to date with our previous webinar events and details, as well as be a part of a community that seeks to engage with peace and justice through practical opportunities to learn, serve, pray, and advocate in our community and around the world together. And before we go further, I wanted to go over a couple of housekeeping tips so that we can properly support you during the session. So if you feel comfortable, I would encourage you to keep your video on so we can get acquainted with all your lovely faces. Please keep yourself on mute through the presentation. And if you're having any technical issues, you can privately message Katie in the chat box and she'll be able to help you. I also wanted to let everyone know that these sessions are recorded, but your name and video will not be shown on the recording if you keep yourself muted during the presentation. And as the speakers share, I would encourage you to write your questions as they come to mind in the chat box. That way, when we move into Q&A after the presentations, we can do so more smoothly. But before I introduce the speakers, I'd like to acknowledge with respect that we are on the unceded traditional ancestral land of the Coast Salish peoples, and specifically Matsqui and Sumas First Nations, who are members of Stolo Nation. The Stolo people are the people of the river, and they have lived in the Fraser Valley for more than 10,000 years. We are grateful to God, our Creator, who has placed us here to share this land, to work towards respectful relationships and peace, to be good stewards of the land which sustains us and gives us life. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speakers. First, we'll be hearing from Jennifer Mpungu. She has been working with MCCBC since 2005 as the Migration and Resettlement Program Coordinator and has given much leadership to the refugee work. She has the unique perspective of experiencing firsthand the complexity of the refugee continuum that starts with displacement to permanent resettlement. From her Abbotsford office, she equips and partners with Mennonite congregations, families, and diverse community groups to sponsor refugees from overseas while advocating for refugee rights and policies that support newcomers in Canada. She considers herself blessed to be in a position where she can combine ministry and her passion. Following Jennifer, we'll be hearing from Richard Belcham, who is the Executive Director of Inasmuch Community Society in Abbotsford. Inasmuch provides transition housing, settlement services, and customized employment support for refugee claimants in the Fraser Valley. Richard is a passionate advocate for refugee claimants and loves to remove barriers to service access, giving them the very best start to their new lives in Canada. He has been involved with MAP since 2018, first as a member and then as co-chair of the Information Working Group, where he worked with a team to create MAP website, as well as starting over an evening of stories and more at the University of the Fraser Valley. As co-chair of MAP, he's been integral to the acquisition of projects to assist refugees seeking housing via the Ministry of Jobs, Economic Development, and Competitiveness. Richard also co-hosted MAP's first online celebration of World Refugee Day in June 2020. And prior to working for Inasmuch, he was Employee Experience Manager at a large manufacturing company in the Fraser Valley. He has an extensive background in HR, corporate communications, and marketing. Originally from the UK, Richard emigrated to Canada in 2011 and has been a resident of the Fraser Valley ever since. Richard is also the host of the Along the Way podcast featuring Refugee Stories, which is an excellent local resource I'd highly recommend you all check out, and we'll be posting a link about that in the chat box as well. So to optimize our Q&A time at the end, we'll be hearing from speakers back to back. So Jennifer, if you are all ready to go, I'd love to hear from you first.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. And and it's great to have everyone, and I'm just going to go right to it. There's a lot to be shared. I hope we will have the time to share as much as we can. However, it's a very wide topic, and so I encourage anyone who would like to know more, feel free to get in touch with me. I'm more than happy to spend some more time with you, telling you about what we do, and perhaps telling you how you can be involved, because there's room for everyone in the work that we do. So, yeah, welcome. So what I hope to go through today is just quickly just share some of the work that we have been doing, and talk about the context that we have right now, which is what's happening with refugees now because of the pandemic, and hopefully that will give you a sense of the work currently. So, Gemma, are we okay for the PowerPoint?
Yeah, looks good.
All right. Thank you. So what I wanted to first start off with was just to get a general context of what we are looking at. Of course, the refugee problem has been with us now for years, and in the past decade, it's kind of gotten worse. But for those of you who may not know exactly, the group of people that we are talking about, I just want to make sure that we're all talking about the same group of people. And so of the number of refugees number of displaced people in the world, there is 26 million that are actually refugees. And so a refugee is somebody who generally is fleeing from their own country because they are fearful on the basis of their race or their religion, their nationality, their membership in a particular social group or political opinion, and afraid to approach their own authorities for their protection. And so, or sometimes they are unwilling to do that. So they then flee, and those are the people that we refer to as refugees. So among the many displaced persons in the world, there's 80 million right now. 26 million of those would be refugees. Then, of course, there are other groups that are also part of that displaced population. There's IDPs, internally displaced, and you can see the numbers there. And so why do we have this situation? Many of you, of course, are familiar with the recent wars and other political disruptions, and even natural disasters that have led to different peoples being displaced. We have the Syrian conflict, which has been going on for over a decade now. Some of you would have heard about the South Sudanese displacement crisis following its independence. There's the refugees from Myanmar. You've heard about those going to Bangladesh. There's the Venezuelans currently that have been crossing Latin America and the Caribbean. Then in Africa, in the Sahel region, the conflict and climate change there have been endangering many communities for a long time. And then we have the renewed conflicts in Afghanistan, Iraq, Libya, Somalia, and an ongoing conflict in Central Africa that's also been there for many years. And most recently, I'm sure most of you who keep up with international news have seen about the internal displacement in Ethiopia, as well as the huge Eritrean population that was recently refugees displaced from the refugee camps in Ethiopia. And finally, one other that's been lingering for a very long time, another protracted situation, is the Democratic Republic of Congo. So, and of course, one other crisis that sometimes goes unnoticed or unheard of is the humanitarian and displacement crisis in Yemen. So, by and large, we would say that 68% of refugees really are coming from these 5 countries, from Syria, Venezuela, Afghanistan, South Sudan, and Myanmar. Those are the current countries. However, I always say sometimes, looking at these countries, it's almost like they play musical chairs. So sometimes, Afghanistan will be number 1, it will be followed by Colombia. But generally, a certain group of countries which have always been refugee producing countries tend to, keep up to be in the top 10 and just sometimes, may change positions. The last decade, however, brought a major shift, and the interplay between climate, conflict, hunger, poverty, and persecution has created an increasingly complex emergencies, and particularly in these 5 countries. Now, where do these refugees go? Who is hosting these refugees? So again, the top 5 countries for hosting refugees are Turkey, Colombia, Pakistan, Uganda, and most recently, Germany. Predominantly, refugees have been hosted in developing countries. Developing countries have carried the burden of the vast majority of refugees. But of course, recently too, we know that refugees have been making their way to Europe, and that is where many of some of the newer countries now hosting refugees are. So yeah, most people flee close to home. And that's why you find that the majority of them are in developing countries, because developing countries, have the largest number of refugees. Now, for refugees, when we talk about refugee problems, we also talk about solutions for refugee problems for displaced people. So for refugees, there are essentially 3 main solutions that the international community tries to provide. The first one is repatriation, meaning that people can be able to return home in safety and in dignity. The second solution is offered or can be provided by hosting countries, and this is integrating refugees locally into their own communities. This, however, is a very rare occasion. It's very few countries that have policies or laws that provide for the integration of refugees into their communities. And finally, of course, when people cannot return, they cannot integrate in the countries where they are seeking asylum, then the final result or solution is to try and provide for them outside in a third country. And this is where Canada comes in, because Canada has the private sponsorship of refugees program, through which Canada is able to carry out its international mandate to provide and be part of the international community to provide solutions for refugees. So as I said, for most refugees, really their preferred option is to return to their home countries, of course, when conditions allow. But for many protracted crises due to conflict, especially in places like Afghanistan, Syria, Myanmar, this has proved difficult as returns are still not safe. Further, the pandemic has also thrown up new barriers to voluntary repatriation, as states are reluctant to receive back their own nationals, despite the right of citizens, of course, to return to their own country. So further, I would say that resettlement countries too, like Canada, the US, in turn, have had or have accepted a limited number of refugees for resettlement for various reasons. And so host countries are also struggling to integrate whatever refugee populations that are within their territories. So there's definitely been a shift from a decade of solutions to the current situation where we are seeing more and more people unable to find durable solutions. So if we think about the source countries for refugees, as I said, these don't change much. And so in terms of the sponsorship, for example, that we do, the resettling refugees, when we work with groups, you will see that there's a very close correlation between the countries that I mentioned previously in terms of refugee producing countries to the work that we do, the refugees that we are resettling. So you see there, for example, Syria and Syrians have been top of the list all the way from about 2014 and continue to be so up to now. And I would say that for MCC, for example, on a yearly basis, we're able to, MCC BC, I should say, we're able to sponsor about 100, 110 refugees. And overall, MCC, we probably sponsor about 500 refugees each year. But this is a drop in the ocean. If you think about, the number of people who are displaced and needing to find help. Overall, Canada in general resettles between 2,100 to 30,000 refugees through its private sponsorship program and the government assisted refugee program, which is an exclusive program that the government itself runs to sponsor or to bring refugees to Canada. So if I may quickly then jump to what has been happening in terms of the current situation. You recall, of course, that we began to hear about the outbreak of the COVID pandemic in March of last year. And as, of course, it began to spread out of China, there was much fear that refugees and other displaced vulnerable people, particularly living in camps and in other densely populated areas, would be hit particularly hard because we know that for refugees and people in such living in such conditions, it was impossible to socially distance. The thing that we're told would help, and protect us. These same people lack access to water, sanitation, and hygiene facilities, and of course have very limited access to healthcare. But thank God, for reasons that still confound experts, the high death rates predicted in these settings have not come to pass, at least so far. As of mid-February, for example, nearly 50,000 cases of COVID-19 and around 450 deaths have been recorded out of a global population of more than 80 million refugees and displaced people. That said, vulnerabilities of refugees are very specific to the context, but there are some broad trends that have been identified, and these are some of the ones that I would like to speak to. So the pandemic second and third order impacts have had a huge effect on the refugee community, increasing displacement, and limiting opportunities for work and resettlement. Another impact has been that the pandemic has led to setbacks for refugee protection. From the beginning, the pandemic has been leveraged by governments to restrict access to protection. For example, 144 countries currently have border closures in place, and another 60 have not made any exceptions for refugees or asylum seekers. So pushback of asylum seekers has also risen in the past year, with the virus used as a distraction or excuse. Another impact has been that aside from the threats to health and access to asylum, the pandemic has also undermined the social and economic rights of refugees and the displaced. With the most vulnerable populations, they often depend on the informal sector and the informal economy. And they, of course, then are the first to suffer the economic impacts of such things as a lockdown. Many lost their jobs, and obviously that leads to things like being evicted from their homes. So, being victimized and re-traumatized all over again. As well, it's also been noted that refugees, especially girls, who account for about 40% of the 9.7 million children who may never return to school because they have dropped out during the pandemic. And this, of course, has reversed years of progress in ensuring girls in particular receive an education. And another note, another impact that has also been noted has been that the pandemic has also drastically reduced the availability of lasting solutions to long-term displacement and has forced some to return home in unsafe situations. And that's really, really bad because many of the people who have had to return have faced starvation. Some have faced kidnappings, and even some have been killed. So the number of vulnerable refugees also being safely resettled to new countries at the same time has also plummeted during the pandemic. In fact, for the first time since the UNHCR was set up in 2020, they had to suspend departures and overall resettlement numbers. I recall that we even had refugees who had been booked and were on flights being off-boarded because they could no longer travel. And, if you talk about resettlement numbers, for example, we are talking about 12,000 being resettled compared to 107,000 last year. On our part here at MCC, MCC BC, our numbers for 2020 evidence this dismal record. We only had 12 refugees arrive in 2020, and right now in 2021, so far, only one refugee has arrived. And so it's things have not been good. And the fact that, we still do not know when, travel can resume to pre-pandemic levels is very concerning, because the conditions in these countries continue to worsen. Conditions, especially because these are the same countries where refugees are not being prioritized for vaccination. And so with deterioration in the economic status, the collapse in health systems, we are very, very concerned about what's going on. So having said that, I would say that we are doing the best that we can in terms of trying to advocate for refugees. We are hopeful. We are hopeful that as you know, the country, our own country, begins to relax the restrictions and government offices begin to function at some level of normalcy, that we'll be able to see refugees arrive, because everything that we do in terms of sponsorship, our success is measured in the number of refugees that we can bring to Canada, that we can, help re-establish their lives and rebuild their new lives here in Canada. And so we are concerned, and we would like to just have, everybody support any efforts that are out there in terms of advocating for the resumption of travel, the resumption of Canada's previous commitments to the number of refugees that they have determined that should come to Canada. So I will stop there and maybe take some questions later. Thank you.
Well, it's always tough to follow Jennifer. Her brain is full of the most amazing information and knowledge, and it's just a privilege to be in Abbotsford with her and to have known her for quite some time. So Jennifer, thank you for that big global picture. If I may, what I'd really like to do is bring it local and make it real locally, because that's when you see these big picture things and the big statistics and the millions and millions of people who are displaced, it's really hard to get your head around, and it doesn't feel real. And the solutions seem intractable and impossible, but actually there are some really good solutions, and there's good news for people, and that's true in Abbotsford, and it's a small part of a very big country, and the truth is that people are coming to Canada to seek asylum. They're coming for safety. They're fleeing some terrible things, and they're looking for a place that's safe and secure and that they can settle and start to rebuild. And that's what Inasmuch Community Society does. We're a small not-for-profit. We're based in Abbotsford. We have two large transition houses where we can host up to 25 folks at a time. They're asylum seekers or refugee claimants, and just to give you a little bit of a definition around who they are, they're the people who have made their own way to Canada themselves. They haven't come as part of a sponsorship agreement, whether a private one like MCC or through the government, and so they come with basically their own support. They have no status when they come to the country. They may have come across the borders irregularly, and they face a long time ahead of them of going through a refugee protection hearing, which is where the government assess their case and to check whether their claim is legitimate. And it's quite a traumatic, difficult thing to go through. So Inasmuch and the team at Inasmuch support people through that process. We help them with all the day-to-day things that they need, just very basic things like food and accommodation and a safe place to stay, and a settlement worker who helps them through the process and paperwork and all of those things. And you know, the reality is, as Jennifer says, COVID has had a big impact, and the number of people coming to BC has reduced immensely because they can't get across the border. And Canada is using the pandemic as an opportunity to push its borders further away from Canada. So now people have to jump through a number of hoops even to get out of their own countries, with exit visas and interviews, and they can still be turned away on the planes themselves. So when they finally get here, they've already been through a number of barriers in order to get here. And there's something called the Safe Third Country Agreement, which is a bit of a technical document, but it means that if a refugee, if someone's seeking asylum in a safe country such as the United States, they should make their claim there, and they shouldn't then come to Canada to claim asylum here, even though the reality for refugee claimants in the United States is it's not a safe country. And so Canada recently, just in this last week, started talking about extending the Safe Third Country Agreement between border posts. So that would stop, again, it would limit the ability of people to get into Canada to find the safety that they need. And so that's something that's very concerning from the pandemic, and watching how countries across the world are using the pandemic to restrict refugee protection. And you see cases like Denmark, where they're starting to deport people and send them back to Syria, deeming that it's a safe country when it's patently not true. And countries across Europe are looking at processing people offshore to stop them actually trying to get into the country. And so asylum seekers really are the people at in the margins, and can so easily fall through the cracks. And that's why Inasmuch really was started, to offer some kind of sanctuary and protection for these people who have fled terrible things, and to find safety in Canada. And so that's what we continue to do, despite the restrictions and the border issues. In fact, just yesterday, we welcomed a family who had driven from Montreal all the way to Vancouver to find safety. They had a very bad experience in Quebec, and so they wanted to come to BC to restart, and we had 45 minutes warning that they would arrive. And so we rushed around and got a house ready and got their rooms ready, and we welcomed them last night. And so that's really the heart of Inasmuch. That's what we do. We want to welcome people, we want to establish them and set them going, and so that's really what we do. And people often say to me, "Oh, goodness me, I can't imagine what they've been through and the stories that they have." And it's true, they do have some extraordinary stories, and they've been through amazing things. And how they still stand and smile, I have no idea, but they do. And I think there's an inbuilt resilience that is incredible. So, if I may, I'd just like to quickly tell you a story about a woman who came to us with her husband some years ago. She was a women's rights activist in Kurdistan, northern Iraq, and she campaigned against honor killing and female genital mutilation and the corruption of the government there. And and ISIS came for her, and she and her husband had to flee, and they left Iraq, and they came via Turkey, and then London, and then finally to New York, where they thought they were going to be able to claim refugee protection. Unfortunately, they were robbed in their hotel room and their jewelry was stolen. And so they heard that they might be able to get some help over in Seattle. So they came over to Seattle, and it turned out to be a dead-end lead. And so they literally ran out of options. And so the two of them, with just a backpack between them, crossed Peace Arch Park and came across the border through the brambles and got scratched and, inevitably hurt. And then they walked into Vancouver from Peace Arch Park, and they couldn't find accommodation, and they had very little money. And so they spent a couple of nights in Queen Elizabeth Park on a bench in the rain before they were able to get in touch with an agency in Vancouver, who then said, there's some room in Abbotsford if you would like to go. And they said, what is Abbotsford? We have no idea. And eventually they came, and they got on the train and they came out to Abbotsford, and we picked them up and welcomed them and helped them start to rebuild their lives. And you know, they've been through so much. And the husband, he could say please, thank you, and sorry, and spent most of his time saying sorry. And over the course of the last 5 years, because they've been here 5 years now, they managed to find work, and she is now pursuing her talents and her skills in order to help women write their stories and to tell their stories. And he has finally got back into his job of an accountant, and is studying for his CPA. And they have a little boy, and they've built their life in Canada slowly but surely. And it's a long haul, and trying to capture it all in a very short time on a webinar is very difficult to do. But I just thought I would share their story because it's one of hope, and it's one of, if you just open your hearts and your minds a little to the folks who are coming, there's incredible stories. And so I would encourage everyone who's on this webinar and who watches this to explore and to try and find some of the stories behind the statistics, the stories behind the headlines, because those are the things that will change people's hearts and minds. If you're interested, there's lots of ways of doing it on YouTube, and on Netflix has some good series, and there's all kinds of ways to explore. I'm going to shamelessly plug my podcast, Along the Way Stories, because that's a great way to hear people's stories. And that's a great thing to share with other people when you're trying to talk about or advocate for refugees and refugee claimants. Telling stories is the way forward, because it reaches beyond those big statistics, those big intractable things where we talk about 80 million people displaced. It's very difficult to understand what that actually looks like. But if you sit next to someone and they tell you their story, you understand. And so that would be an encouragement for you. And I guess the last thing, because I'm aware of time, the last thing I would love to say is that it's grassroots communities that will change the situation for these folks. It's not the big organizations. They help, they change policy, they can work with government, but actually it's the small organizations that walk alongside these folks when they come day to day. It's the MCCs, it's the Inasmuches of the world that will change it. And it's the hearts and minds of ordinary people in ordinary towns across Canada who are prepared to welcome folks that makes a difference. So I really believe that change can happen, but it's going to happen one human, one handshake, and one hug at a time. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you so much for sharing with us your knowledge and just the story of resilience and of hope of these people, and the barriers that they have to jump through in order to have resettlement here. We're going to be moving into a Q&A period. So if you have some burning questions or things you'd like to ask Richard or Jennifer, please put them in the chat box. To just get some conversation going, I have a first question to both Richard and Jennifer. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about or speak to some of the negative publicity about refugees that is so often depicted in Western media. Why is there so much misinformation? This seems to be an agenda behind these, the ways that these people are being portrayed. And perhaps also, what are some solutions to this? What are ways that we can combat this misinformation and the filters that people are being portrayed through? So I don't know if either of you want to respond to that.
Honestly, I think one of the things that strikes me the most when I hear these things is almost it's fear based out of ignorance. It's fear of the other. It's what if, who are these people? Where have they come from? Why do they don't look like me? They don't sound like me. Their names aren't like mine, and they're coming here. And it's a very scary thing if you don't understand why people flee countries, why they leave and seek refugee protection, it's very difficult to then empathize with them and understand why they're here. So that would be my initial thought. And if I may, I'll just tell a very quick story about my mum, my dear mum in England, who the asylum seeking or folks seeking asylum in England are treated very differently than they are in Canada, and the right-wing media is very strong there, and the conversations around asylum seekers are never positive or very rarely positive. And so when I started doing the work that I do, my mum was hesitant, and she was like, well, who are these people and why are you doing it? And so I shared the podcast with her and said, just listen to their stories and see what you think. And so a couple of weeks later, I gave her a call and we were talking, and she said, oh, I listened to the podcast. And I said, what did you think? And she said very simply, I had no idea. I had no idea who these people were or why they were here. And now when I hear the news about asylum seekers crossing the English Channel, I think, well, that could be like them. That could be like the people Richard's talking to. And it was a really simple shift, but it was enough to soften people's approaches. And so I think it is a fair thing, and I think it comes from a lack of knowledge, but it's also when people put themselves in the shoes of an asylum seeker or a refugee and they go, oh, that could be me, that's when things change. Sorry, Jennifer, I jumped in. I'll be quiet now.
Richard, that's perfect. You took the words right out of my mouth. I always say that but for the grace of God, there go we. It could be any one of us. And I think the minute that people put themselves in those situations, you think about, if this was my child, what would I want for my child? If this was my elderly parent, what would I want for them? Then we have a very different perspective about those people. Those people are us, and so that's one thing that the minute that most people are able to connect at that human and heart level, there's a very definite shift in how people think about them, what they're willing to do for them. And for me, in the years that I've done this work, it's amazing. There's more good people. There's more people willing to help to embrace that stranger, quite honestly, than the few who have a lot of negative things to say. And like Richard rightly said, it's really just about fear of the, of the unknown. What are their customs? We don't speak the same language. We don't share the same religion, so you are not sure. And so when you begin to sort of peel the the onion back, and you begin to show that you have the same sort of likes, you share the same values, you laugh at the same jokes, you have the same temperament and all these things, you love soccer or you like to do cross stitch, you just realize, oh my goodness, they're just another neighbor, they're just another sister, they're just another woman or man or whatever. And so it just normalizes everything. It's sad because if it's, and this, the fear of the other doesn't just exist, say, in Canada. Xenophobia is a big, huge problem. And in fact, during this pandemic, it has actually been exacerbated in certain countries because, as resources have diminished, for example, access to health, services has diminished, then people feel like, no, you don't belong here. You are the other. You do not have a right to this because there's only very little and it's just for us. So that has been a big problem too. And so, when it comes to media and it comes to, what we hear, unfortunately, it seems to me, I could be wrong, but it seems to me that it's only bad news that sells, If we were to go to, some media station, and Richard wanted to share that story about that family that came from, Quebec, or I wanted to share about some fantastic stories of people who have survived so well, it's not the first thing that people are wanting to air, But when there's a disaster, when somebody dies, then it's all over the news. And I find that that's probably just what is business for them. Bad news sells. Good news is boring, which is very sad. So we haven't had, therefore, the support that I would expect from a very, very influential medium, the media. So we have to do a lot of the work ourselves. And it's story by story, family by family, and community by community, just helping to get the word out. For example, for a very long time, we've had this fake news going around that refugees are taken much better care of than, our own seniors or our veterans and so forth. That's so not true. But there's never been one time, at least to my knowledge, that any, major media houses come and said, look, this thing has been going on, these stories have been told, how can we help, talk about what really happens. So it's really left to, us as individuals to want to educate ourselves, to want to get to know the truth. Otherwise, it's not going to come from, watching late night news and watching CBC and everybody else, or listening to anybody else for that matter. We have to do the work, but I'm so glad that, as I said, when people get to know who this refugee person is, they realize that's just me, or that's just my brother or sister or whatever it is. So I'm very encouraged. The more I do this work, the more my faith in humanity is restored.
It's interesting with World Refugee Day coming up on June the 20th. There is more of a focus just this week on not, I don't want to use positive as a way of describing the stories, but that people are willing to go a little bit deeper and dive a little bit deeper into the stories and the issues around refugees. And I think events like the multi-agency partnership, which I work for, with their events that they're doing, where people are sharing stories and they are sharing issues, and you see people like the Vancouver Public Library who are coming on board to host things because they see the importance of it and they see the importance of storytelling as a way forward. So I would encourage folks to find out more by digging a little bit deeper and not being afraid of these things, and meet with organizations like Inasmuch and MCC. We always look forward to talking to people and explaining things, answering questions. Ask all the difficult questions. We will happily answer them. And as you can probably tell with Jennifer and I, we'll probably talk far too long and answer all your questions, even the ones that you didn't know that you needed to ask. So we would love you to connect. Definitely. Yeah.
Thank you, Richard and Jennifer. Yeah, it seems like overwhelmingly some of the ways to combat these issues of fear and prejudice and just ignorance seems to be bringing it back to people and humanizing people again, that they aren't just a statistic, they aren't just a number, but these are people who could be your family, they could be your brother or sister, and using stories and education to enlighten people from a place of love. So we have another question here, and I'll pose it to both of you again. Canada's immigration system is often criticized as disjointed. And independent grassroots organizations do great work, but aren't clearly accessible enough to the folks that need to navigate it all. Has this time of limited intake since the pandemic allowed time and focus on clarifying or optimizing this network of support services?
Weirdly, there has been some great things that have come out of the pandemic, particularly with the latter half of it. The government have stepped up in terms of technological provision. And so, for example, the Immigration and Refugee Board of Canada are now doing online virtual hearings. And so they're doing them over Microsoft Teams. And the when you originally think of it, you think, oh, well, that's not going to be great because of the awkwardness of it. Actually, it's worked out really well because people don't have to travel into Vancouver to have their hearing. They don't need to find childcare. They can do it from the comfort of their own home where they feel safe and they're able to articulate their story very well. And so that's been a good thing that's come out of it. There's also been some opportunities for for some funding that has come out of COVID. For example, there's a project to work on a website that's dedicated for refugee claimants first arriving into BC, that they'll be able to find those systems and find those support networks really, really quickly. And if it wasn't for the time that the pandemic has freed up in some ways, that would be a very difficult project to get off the ground. So there are some really good things that are happening, particularly around with technology, that we're seeing the connections and those networks forming and working together really well. And again, just to make it real, last night when we heard about this family who were coming, we got a call from someone within our network who was able just to pick up the phone and say, hey, do you have room? We have a family and we don't know what to do with them. And we were able to say, come and stay. And I think that's some of the joyful things about the pandemic, is the networks are ever stronger. And it's people like Jennifer who pull these networks together and pull these people together that makes it really work so well. So again, I've spoken too much and I should let Jennifer jump in.
No, Richard, thanks for sharing that, because indeed, or even on the resettlement sponsorship side of things, technology really has been a saving grace, because with visa officers unable to travel, even before the pandemic because of insecurity, now they can just be where they are. And in the refugee camps, particularly where we have other agencies such as the IOM or the UNHCR, who do have access to technology, they can be invited to those agencies' offices, and the officer sitting in some far-off country can actually interview those people, as opposed to saying that, well, you know, we are unable to travel, and so for the next 2 years, because quite honestly, in some visa offices, it takes about 2 years before a visa officer is able to go out into those refugee camps to do interviews. So, for example, if you were slated to have an interview this year, and God forbid that for whatever reason you did not actually manage to get that interview going, you would have to wait another 2 years before that officer came back to that mission. So that's horrible, it's terrible. But with this, we have seen a huge effort by IRCC to actually get as much of that technology and to facilitate as much as they can to have such processes as interviews being conducted. And so the other way that it has also helped is that because there's a limited capacity on the ground in terms of the visa offices, Canadian visa offices abroad, they don't have as many staff as we would like to see dealing with a huge inventory of files there. IRCC is able now to actually have officers who are sitting in maybe in Ottawa, maybe in London, you know, actually deal with those files and even be able to do some of those initial assessments that help to move forward the files so that we can actually see people arrive here sooner than later. So that would not, I doubt that would have happened at the pace that it did if, you know, things hadn't been pushed by the, you know, the impacts of the pandemic. Actually, and that's a good thing, like Richard, like you said, because we hope that that is something that will be sustained. And indeed, we have heard that because it's working so well, even for our IRCC, in that they also don't have to send physically officers all the way from Ottawa to go, say, to the Nairobi office or to go to Istanbul to sit there and interview people. It's working out so much better. They're able to allocate a lot more resources to the processing of files than they otherwise would have had with officers going on tours of duty. So that's a good thing. Beyond that, you know, we still wait to see you know, how the different systems that are also being put in place to deal with the processing of files. For example, recently IRCC opened an office, I believe it was in Nova Scotia, I think, an additional office, you know, hired a lot of new staff, again, to deal with the inventories. So these are things that probably would not have been sparked if there hadn't been this outcry about, what is going on, how is the government actually dealing with refugee files during this pandemic. So we are grateful for, some of those good things that unintended positive consequences of the pandemic is what I'd call them.
Okay, I think our session is coming to a close here. So on behalf of MCCBC, I just want to say thank you all so much for joining, staying engaged and thinking critically in this time together. Thank you so much to our lovely speakers for sharing your expertise and insight into these topics. Your work is so incredibly valuable and you are quite literally changing people's lives, which is so beautiful and encouraging to see. So we've heard in the session some ways that we can support refugees from home, whether that be advocacy work, supporting the travel refugees, whether that be thinking about sponsoring refugee family. And then there's educating ourselves and educating those around us. And I'm a huge advocate for education and the power in that. And it's really just a ripple effect. You in asking those questions yourself and in humility and out of curiosity. And then it spreads. And I just encourage and challenge you all who are listening to keep digging, keep asking those questions, and also providing opportunities to have those conversations with people in your own context. So we'll be sending everyone a follow-up email with a short survey. It takes maybe 1 minute that will help us kind of reflect and improve on these sessions. And I think Katie will be posting that in the chat box. And I just wanted to make sure, did Richard and Jennifer, did you both promoted the events that are coming up? I think Jennifer did too. Yeah, okay, awesome. Great, so again, just thank you for tuning in, everyone, and to our speakers. And I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day and enjoy this beautiful weather we're going to be having this weekend.
Thank you, Gemma. Really appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone.